The brass key to the front door has a heavy, cold weight in my hand, but not nearly as heavy as the silence that settles over this house the moment they leave. I stood by the kitchen island, watching the taillights of my son Julian's SUV disappear down the gravel driveway, kicking up dust that caught the yellow glare of the porch light. He hadn't said goodbye to me. Not really. He had leaned down, his cheek briefly brushing against mine, while his eyes remained fixed on his phone screen, murmuring something about beating the Sunday evening bridge traffic. Behind him, his wife Clara was already in the passenger seat, adjusting the air conditioning, while their 2 teenage children, Leo and Maya, sat in the back, with their heads bowed toward their respective screens, oblivious to the woman standing on the porch. On the kitchen counter sat 3 empty wine bottles, a platter smeared with the grease of a ribeye roast I had spent 4 hours preparing, and a pile of damp beach towels dumped unceremoniously near the pantry door. In the hallway bathroom, the shower was still dripping. A half-used bottle of expensive salon shampoo, which I had bought specifically because Clara mentioned she liked the scent, lay on its side, leaking a slow, pearlescent blue puddle onto the marble tile. They had been here for 4 days. During those 4 days, I had spoken perhaps 200 words. Most of them were variations of, "Yes, of course. I have more towels in the hall closet," and "I'll make sure to buy the organic eggs next time." I am 72 years old. My name is Eleanor. For 42 of those years, this house, a 5-bedroom, mid-century craftsman nestled on 3 acres of prime coastal land just 2 hours outside the city, has been my home. My late husband Arthur and I bought it when it was little more than a drafty shell. We spent decades restoring the oak floorboards, planting the orchard of pear and plum trees in the back, and raising our 2 children, Julian and Beatrice, within these walls. When Arthur died 5 years ago, Julian stood at the casket, held my hand, and whispered, "We're going to take care of you, Mom. You'll never be alone in this big house." It was a beautiful promise. But words, I have learned, are often used to pave over the inconvenient truths of human selfishness. They did not take care of me. Instead, they discovered that a widow living alone in a 5-bedroom house with an ocean view is the ultimate luxury. It started small, a weekend here, a holiday there. Then came the spare keys. First, Julian wanted one in case of emergencies. Then Beatrice, my 38-year-old daughter, insisted she needed one because her apartment in the city got suffocating during the summer months. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boundary between family and facility began to blur. I became the invisible caretaker of a private resort. They didn't call to ask how my joints were faring in the damp coastal air. They called to ask if the guest suite was free for the 3rd weekend of July. They didn't ask if I needed help with the rising property taxes or the roof that leaked whenever the wind blew from the east. They asked if I could make sure the fridge was stocked with the sparkling water they liked, the one that cost $6 a bottle at the organic market 12 miles away. Yesterday morning, I stood in the kitchen making espresso for Clara. She was sitting at the breakfast bar, scrolling through her iPad. "Eleanor," she said, not looking up, "the Wi-Fi in the west bedroom is dreadfully slow. Julian had to drop off his Zoom call twice yesterday. We really need to get a booster installed before we come back next month." "I'll look into it," I murmured, setting the cup down beside her. She didn't say thank you.
She merely reached for the cup, took a sip, and frowned slightly. "Did you use the skim milk? I told Julian to tell you I'm only doing oat milk this month." "Julian didn't mention it," I said. Clara sighed, a small, patronizing sound that fluttered through the quiet room. "Well, he's so busy. You should really just keep a carton of oat milk in the fridge anyway. It's better for everyone's inflammation." She went back to her tablet. I stood there, holding the empty milk carton, feeling the strange, hollow sensation of being a ghost in my own kitchen. I was a service provider who was failing to meet their standards. Later that afternoon, Beatrice arrived. She didn't come alone. She brought 3 of her friends from the city, young, loud people with expensive sunglasses and trailing scents of heavy cologne and sunscreen. They didn't greet me so much as they announced themselves, dropping their designer weekenders in the foyer. "Mom, we're going straight down to the beach," Beatrice said, kissing my cheek with dry, hasty lips. "Can you make sure the outdoor shower has clean towels? And we'll probably want some of those little lemon tarts you make for dinner." "Beatrice, I didn't prepare for 6 people for dinner," I said quietly. She paused, her hand on the screen door, looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "Mom, it's just tarts. You have all day. What else are you doing?" She didn't wait for an answer. The screen door clicked shut behind her, and her laughter drifted up from the path toward the water, mingling with the cries of the gulls. "What else are you doing?" The question stayed with me all evening as I washed their dishes, as I folded their laundry, as I wiped down the outdoor furniture they had left cluttered with empty beer cans and discarded lime wedges. I sat in my small armchair in the corner of the living room while they gathered around the fireplace I had built, drinking my late husband's prized whiskey, the bottles they knew he had saved for special occasions, and discussing their upcoming winter trips to Aspen. They spoke about the house as if it were an asset they already owned. "When we inherit this place," Julian said, his voice deep and confident under the influence of the scotch, "I think we should knock down the wall between the kitchen and the sunroom. It's too closed off. My mother's generation loved these tiny dark rooms, but it doesn't work for modern entertaining." "Oh, absolutely," Clara agreed, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "And we can turn the carriage house into a proper rental unit. It's just sitting there collecting dust. It's such a waste." I sat in the dark corner, the shadow of the tall floor lamp concealing my face. They didn't look at me. They didn't offer me a glass. They didn't ask if the smoke from the fireplace was bothering my chest. They had already written me out of the ledger of the living. To them, I was simply the temporary occupant of their future property, an old woman whose primary function was to keep the sheets clean and the gardens manicured until she finally had the decency to slip away. A cold breeze blew in through the open window, carrying the scent of salt water and rotting seaweed from the shore. I looked down at my hands, spotted with age, the skin thin as parchment. I realized then that they did not love this house because it was my home. They loved it because it was free. And they did not love me. They loved the convenience I provided. I stood up quietly, my knees aching, and walked out of the room. Not one of them turned their head to see where I was going. Monday morning brought the rain. It was a soft gray drizzle that blurred the horizon where the dark ocean met the sky, turning the coast into a watercolor of charcoal and slate. I woke at my usual time, 6 o'clock, before the birds had even begun their damp chirping. For 40 years, my body has operated on this rhythm, independent of alarm clocks. I lay in the quiet of my bedroom, listening to the rhythmic, comforting tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway below. It was a clock Arthur had bought at an estate sale in our 2nd year of marriage. He used to wind it every Sunday night, a small ritual that made him feel like the master of his own time. Now that duty fell to me. My lower back throbbed, a dull, hot ache, from the hours spent leaning over the sink the night before, scrubbing the burnt-on garlic butter from the roasting pan Clara had insisted on using, and then leaving in the sink to soak. I got out of bed, wrapped my wool cardigan tight around my shoulders, and walked downstairs. The house was cold. The furnace was old, and Julian had turned the thermostat down to 60 degrees before they left, murmuring that heating an empty 5-bedroom house to 70 is just throwing money into the ocean, Mom. He had said this while wearing a cashmere sweater I had knitted for him 3 winters ago. I filled the kettle. While I waited for the water to boil, I began the ritual of reclaiming my home. In the living room, I moved the heavy leather armchairs back to their original positions. Julian liked them pulled close to the television. I preferred them facing the bay window, where the light was best for reading. I picked up 3 empty highball glasses from the side tables, noting the white rings their wet bottoms had left on the polished cherry wood. I had asked Julian twice to use the slate coasters Arthur had made, but they remained stacked in their little holder, untouched. Children, I have realized, rarely notice a mother's labor until it stops. To them, clean sheets appear on beds like morning dew, and coffee mugs wash themselves. They do not see the bent spine, the dry skin of hands soaked too long in dishwater, or the quiet sigh of relief when the front door finally clicks shut. I carried the glasses to the kitchen and then walked up the stairs to the guest rooms to strip the linens. I began with the master guest room, the one Julian and Clara always claimed because it had the private balcony. The bed was a tangled nest of heavy duvet and sheets. The room smelled of Clara's expensive lavender perfume and the stale, sweet scent of Julian's vape. As I pulled the pillowcases off, a piece of folded paper fell from the bedside table, landing silently on the rug. I bent to pick it up, expecting it to be a receipt or a dry-cleaning ticket. But when I unfolded it, I saw Julian's distinctive, neat handwriting, the sharp, slanted cursive he had developed in law school. It was written on the back of a printed email from an estate planning attorney named David Vance, whose offices were downtown near Julian's firm. My eyes traced the bullet points Julian had jotted down in the margins. Current market value, estimated $1.8 million to $2.1 million based on recent shore sales. Primary residence capital gains tax exemption. Transfer of deed versus living trust. Vance recommends trust to avoid probate. Capacity assessment. Must establish sound mind before signing transfer. Assisted living options. Harborview Manor, approximately $6,500 per month, near Clara's mother. I stood there, the damp linen draped over my arm, reading the words over and over until they ceased to look like English and became merely black marks on a white page. Capacity assessment. My hand did not shake. That surprised me. Instead, a strange, crystalline coldness settled in my chest, a sensation like drinking ice water on a winter morning. My son, the boy I had stayed up with through 3 bouts of croup, the boy whose university tuition I had paid by selling my mother's antique jewelry, was sitting in my guest room planning my relocation. He was calculating the value of the walls that sheltered me, weighing them against the cost of a room in a facility near his mother-in-law, a woman he openly detested, but whose proximity made visitation logistics easier for Clara. They had not even waited for me to show signs of faltering. At 72, my mind was as sharp as the paring knife I used to core the apples from the garden. I still did my own taxes. I still drove myself to the pharmacy. I still managed the modest portfolio Arthur had left me. But to Julian, my independence was not a victory. It was an obstacle. It was a delay in his financial timeline. A sharp buzz in my pocket broke the silence. I pulled out my phone. It was a text message from Beatrice. "Mom, left my cream silk blouse in the guest closet. The dry cleaner said it needs special care. Can you express mail it to my office today? I need it for a dinner on Wednesday. Thanks." I looked from the screen to the open closet door. The blouse was there, hanging on a wire hanger, a pale, limp thing that looked like a shed skin. There was no, "How are you this morning, Mom?" No, "Thank you for the dinner." No inquiry about my arthritis, which she had watched me limp through while carrying her heavy luggage up the stairs. I looked back at the paper in my hand. Capacity assessment. I folded the paper carefully, smoothing the creases with my thumb until the edges were sharp and precise. Then I slid it into the pocket of my cardigan, right next to the brass key to the front door. I walked down the stairs, my steps slow and deliberate. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, the heavy bronze bell echoing through the empty hallways. Some people confuse unconditional love with permanent access. They believe that because a mother's heart is wide, her boundaries are non-existent. They think they can walk through your life, muddying the carpets and taking the furniture, and that you will always be there, smiling, holding the door open for their next arrival. They are wrong. I set the kettle back on the stove, turned off the burner, and walked to the small secretary desk in the corner of the den. I pulled out a clean sheet of heavy cream paper and my fountain pen. I did not call Julian. I did not call Beatrice. Instead, I dialed a number I had kept in Arthur's old leather address book, the number of an old friend, a man named Marcus Vance, who had retired from real estate law 3 years ago, but still kept an office overlooking the harbor. "Marcus," I said when he answered, his voice deep and gravelly with age. "It's Eleanor. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Eleanor," he said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his tone, a sound I hadn't heard in my own home for days. Never a disturbance. "How are you holding up down there?" "I am well," I said, looking out the window at the rain falling on the old pear trees. "But I think it is time for me to make some changes. I need to sell the house." Marcus was silent for a long moment. On the other end of the line, I could hear the faint, comforting clatter of a typewriter. He was one of the few lawyers left who refused to fully transition to computers, keeping an old Smith Corona in his study for personal correspondence. "Are you sure, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice softening. "That house is Arthur's legacy. It's your legacy. I know how much sweat you both put into those gardens." "Legacy is for the dead, Marcus," I said, looking down at my reflection in the dark, polished surface of the mahogany desk. "The living have to breathe, and right now, this house is taking the air right out of my lungs." "Does Julian know?" "No," I replied, "and I don't intend for him to know until the ink is dry on the closing papers." There was another pause, heavier this time. Marcus knew my children. He had watched them grow up. He had sat at our dining table for Thanksgiving dinners when Arthur was still alive. He had seen the subtle shift over the last 5 years, the way Julian's voice had taken on a sharp, managerial edge whenever he spoke to me, and the way Beatrice looked at her watch whenever I tried to tell her a story about her father. "If you list it publicly," Marcus said, his legal mind already turning the gears, "Julian will find out within 48 hours. The real estate community down here is small, and Julian has alerts set up for property values in this zip code. He's a real estate attorney, Eleanor. He watches the market like a hawk." "I don't want a sign in the yard, Marcus. I don't want open houses with strangers walking through my bedroom smelling my soap. Surely there is another way." "There is," Marcus said. "I have a client, a family from Chicago. They've been looking for a legacy estate on the Cove for 3 years. They want privacy, they have liquid funds, and they've already told me they don't want to deal with bidding wars. They are willing to pay a premium to buy off-market, directly from an owner, with a quick close." "How quick?" 30 days, cash. No contingencies other than a standard structural inspection, which I can arrange to have done while your family is away." "Do it," I said. "I'll draft the preliminary agreement and contact their representation today. But Eleanor, once we start this wheel turning, it's going to be very hard to stop. Julian and Beatrice are going to be furious. They see that house as their future inheritance." "A future they're already dividing," I said, my finger tracing the sharp crease of the paper I had taken from Julian's room. "Let them be angry, Marcus. Anger is a luxury for people who have never had to rebuild from the ashes." After I hung up, the silence of the house returned, but it felt different now. It no longer felt like the silence of neglect. It felt like the quiet before a long-awaited storm. I picked up Beatrice's silk blouse from the guest closet. It was beautiful, expensive, and fragile. I took it downstairs to the kitchen where I kept a roll of brown butcher paper and packing tape. I folded the blouse carefully, placing a sheet of tissue paper between the folds so the silk wouldn't wrinkle during transit. As I was taping the box closed, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Julian's name. My heart gave a single hard thud against my ribs, then settled into a steady, calm rhythm. "Hello, Julian," I said, keeping my voice soft, light, and slightly breathless. The voice of the gentle, slightly frail mother he expected me to be. "Mom," Julian said. His voice was loud, accompanied by the background hum of city traffic and the occasional beep of a horn. He was driving. "Look, I'm just calling because I think I left some papers in the master guest room, a printed email and some legal notes. They were on the nightstand, or maybe in the drawer. Did you happen to see them when you were cleaning?" I looked at the folded paper resting in my cardigan pocket. "Oh, dear," I said, letting a touch of elderly confusion creep into my tone. "I'm not sure. I stripped the beds this morning and emptied the wastebaskets. I took the big trash bags out to the bin on the curb before the truck came at 8. "You threw them out?" His voice sharpened, the polite facade slipping for a fraction of a second. "Mom, those were important financial documents. Why would you just throw away papers?" Well, they were just loose sheets on the nightstand, Julian, I said, keeping my tone apologetically sweet. You usually leave so much clutter behind. Empty water bottles, old newspapers. I assumed it was just scratch paper. I'm so sorry. Is it something terrible? I heard him swear under his breath, a sharp hiss of air, before he caught himself. No, it's fine. It's fine. I have digital copies. But, Mom, this is exactly what I've been talking to Clara about. What's that, dear? You're getting forgetful. And this house, it's just too much for you to manage. Cleaning up after us, keeping track of everything. It's starting to slip through your fingers. We really need to sit down next weekend and talk about some long-term solutions. We can't have you accidentally throwing away important things, or worse, forgetting to turn off the stove. The insult was delivered wrapped in the warm, suffocating blanket of concern. It was the classic tactic of the slow takeover. First, they convince you that you are failing. Then they step in to save you by taking away your agency. Perhaps you're right, Julian, I murmured, staring at the brown cardboard box containing Beatrice's blouse. Perhaps it is time for a change. Exactly, Julian said, his voice instantly warming now that he thought he was winning. I'm glad you're being sensible about this. We'll talk about it when we come down on Friday. Clara wants to bring some of her friends from the country club for a Saturday luncheon, so make sure the patio furniture is scrubbed down, okay? Thanks, Mom. Love you. Love you too, Julian, I said. The line went dead. I stood in the quiet kitchen, the receiver still in my hand. I looked at the grandfather clock. They are coming on Friday, I thought, and they expect a luncheon on Saturday. I looked down at the box for Beatrice. I wrote her office address on the front in bold black marker. Underneath, I wrote the return address. I didn't write the Orchard House. I wrote the cellar. The home inspector, a quiet man named Thomas with graying hair and grease-stained knuckles, arrived on Wednesday morning under a rare break in the coastal clouds. I watched him from the kitchen window as he walked the perimeter of the house, tapping the cedar shingles with a small rubber mallet, leaning in close to inspect the foundation where the concrete met the earth. He was meticulous. He didn't rush. When he came inside, he carried a heavy flashlight and a clipboard. I offered him a cup of coffee, real coffee, freshly ground, not the instant variety Julian always accused me of buying to save pennies. Thank you, ma'am, Thomas said, taking the mug with a hand that bore the scars of decades of physical labor. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore. The joists in the basement are solid oak, and the plumbing, someone put a lot of care into upgrading these copper pipes. My husband Arthur did the plumbing himself, I said, feeling a familiar, gentle ache in my throat. He said a house only lasts as long as the things you can't see. Thomas smiled, a genuine, respectful expression. He was a smart man. Most of the houses I inspect down here look beautiful on the surface, but underneath, the salt air has rotted the bones. This place? It's built like a fortress. You could live here another 30 years and never have to worry about the structure. Thank you, Thomas, I said quietly, but I won't be living here. He spent 3 hours checking the attic, the crawl space, and the electrical panels. I sat in my armchair in the living room, listening to his footsteps echoing above me. It felt like a medical examination of my life. Every corner of this house held a memory. In the hallway, there was a faint, pale square on the wallpaper where Julian's height chart used to hang. In the den, there was a small dent in the baseboard where Beatrice had crashed her tricycle on her 5th birthday. For years, I had believed these physical marks were sacred. I thought they were the anchor keeping our family joined together. But a house is only a container. If the people inside it do not care for the person who keeps it standing, then the walls are nothing more than a beautiful cage. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus called me back. "The inspection report is pristine, Eleanor," he said. His voice hummed with a quiet satisfaction. "The buyers are ecstatic. They've made an official offer. $2.2 million, cash. They want a 30-day escrow. And they've added a clause. They are willing to buy the house fully furnished. They want to keep the mid-century dining set, the oak bookshelves, and the outdoor teak furniture. They're offering an additional $50,000 for the contents." I looked around the living room. The dining set was the one Arthur and I had bought with our first tax refund. The bookshelves were filled with novels I had read 3 times over and histories Arthur had loved. To my children, these things were clutter. They would eventually have to sort through and throw into a dumpster. To the buyers, they were vintage curation. "Tell them they can keep everything," I said, "except my personal papers, my clothes, and Arthur's journals." "Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, "are you sure? Your children, they won't even have the chance to take a keepsake." "They've had 5 years to take what they wanted, Marcus," I replied. "Whenever they came here, they took my scotch, they took my silver, they took the vintage blankets from the linen closet because they thought they'd look good in their city apartments. They don't want keepsakes, they want assets. If I leave the furniture, I spare them the trouble of pretending to care about our history." "The contract will be ready for your signature tomorrow morning," Marcus said. "I'll courier it to your house. No one will know, Eleanor. The title company will hold the funds in escrow, and the deed won't be recorded until the day of closing." "Perfect," I said. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, cool wind that chased the fog off the water. The courier arrived at 10 o'clock. I signed the heavy stack of legal documents on the kitchen island, using the fountain pen Arthur had given me for our silver anniversary. My signature was steady. It didn't waver. As the courier drove away, I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. It was the feeling of gravity slowly losing its grip on me. At 4 o'clock, the roar of Julian's SUV broke the afternoon quiet. I stood by the window as they piled out. Julian was on his phone, gesturing aggressively with his free hand. Clara stepped out of the passenger side, immediately adjusting her oversized sunglasses and looking at the garden with a critical eye. Behind them, 2 of their friends from the city, a tall, arrogant-looking man named Richard and his wife, a sharp-featured woman named Evelyn, were stretching their legs, looking around the property as if they were arriving at an exclusive bed and breakfast. "Mom!" Julian called out as he pushed open the front door, not waiting for me to answer. "We're here! Richard and Evelyn want to put their bags in the west wing. Did you make sure the guest rooms have those Belgian cotton sheets?" I came out of the kitchen wearing my apron, a gentle, welcoming smile fixed on my face. "Welcome, everyone," I said softly. Clara walked past me, handing me her designer canvas tote bag without looking at me. "Eleanor, there's some artisanal goat cheese and cured meats in there. Put them in the fridge right away, please. They can't sit at room temperature. And we're going to need ice, lots of it. Richard only drinks his gin with crushed ice." "Of course," I said, holding the heavy bag. Richard looked around the foyer, his eyes lingering on the grandfather clock, then on the oil painting of the cove that Arthur had painted himself. "Charming place, Julian," Richard said, his voice dripping with the effortless condescension of old money. "A bit rustic, but the bones are excellent. With the right architect, you could really turn this into something spectacular. It's a shame to let all this space go underutilized." Julian laughed, a loud, performative sound, and clapped Richard on the back. "Exactly what I've been telling my mother. It's just too much for one person. We're working on a transition plan." He looked at me then, a quick, dismissive glance. "Mom, can you get the bags from the trunk? My back is acting up from the drive." I stood in the center of the foyer, the heavy tote bag in my hand, watching my son walk up the stairs of the house I had just sold to a stranger. "Of course, Julian," I said quietly. "I'll take care of everything." The suitcases were heavy. Julian's was a large, hard-shelled Toomey that weighed at least 50 pounds, packed with clothes for a 2-day weekend as if he were traveling for a month. Richard's luggage was equally substantial, made of thick, dark leather that smelled of expensive wax and airport lounges. I hauled them out of the trunk of the SUV, one by one. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, struggled to grip the cold metal handles. I had to rest my knee against the bumper to lift Julian's bag, feeling a sharp, familiar pinch in my shoulder. Julian was standing on the porch, his back to me, laughing at something Richard was saying. He didn't turn around. He didn't reach down to help me as I dragged the heavy cases up the wooden steps, the wheels clattering loudly against the pine boards. "Just put them in the hallway, Mom," Julian called out over his shoulder, his attention already returning to his conversation. "We'll take them up later. Or, actually, if you could just carry them up to the guest rooms now, that would be great. Richard wants to freshen up before we have a drink." "Of course," I said, my voice steady, though my breath was short. I carried them up. It took me 3 trips. With each step up the oak staircase, the physical pain in my joints seemed to burn away, replaced by a strange, humming clarity. Every step was a countdown. 24 steps to the landing, 3 trips, 72 steps in total. As I reached the top landing on the final trip, carrying Clara's vanity case, I heard voices coming from the master guest room. The door was slightly ajar. "And the gardens are just a mess, Evelyn." Clara's voice drifted out, sharp and dripping with dissatisfaction. "She's 72, you know. She just doesn't have the energy to keep up with the weeds. The lavender is overgrown, and the patio stones are practically green with moss. It's embarrassing." "Well, why doesn't she hire a gardener?" Evelyn asked. I could hear the rustle of silk as she unpacked her things. "With what money?" Clara laughed, a low, dismissive sound. "Arthur left her the house, but the liquid assets were modest. Most of his pension went into maintaining the seawall 10 years ago. She's living on a shoestring, Evelyn. That's why we have to step in. She's too proud to admit she's drowning, but she's running this place into the ground. Julian says if we don't take control of the deed soon, the property value will start to suffer." "And she's okay with moving?" Evelyn asked, her voice carrying a faint note of curiosity. She'll do what Julian tells her to do, Clara said, her tone absolute. She has no choice. Once Julian shows her the math on what it costs to heat this place in the winter, she'll realize she can't afford to stay. We'll put her in that little place near my mother. It's very clean. They have bridge on Tuesdays. She'll be much happier there, and we can finally get started on the renovations here. Julian already has an architect drawing up plans for a glass conservatory where the old pantry is. I stood on the landing, holding Clara's vanity case.
The old pantry was where I kept my jars of preserved plums, the ones I harvested from the trees Arthur had planted when Julian was born. It was where the handwritten recipe cards from my mother were stored in a tin box. To Clara, it was just wasted space. To Julian, I was a tenant whose lease was being terminated for the sake of a glass conservatory. The cruelest betrayals do not come from strangers in dark alleys. They come from the people who sit at your dinner table, eating the food you cooked, while calculating the cost of your funeral. They come from the children who look at your aging face and see nothing but an unpaid bill they are tired of waiting to settle. I did not knock. I did not push the door open to confront them. Instead, I set Clara's vanity case down silently outside the door, turned, and walked back down the stairs. That evening, I cooked dinner for 4. I made a beef bourguignon, a dish that took 5 hours of slow braising. I served them on the good porcelain plates, the ones with the delicate blue rim that Arthur had bought me in Paris. They ate greedily, drinking Julian's expensive red wine, laughing and talking about people I didn't know. They spoke over me, around me, and through me. When I brought out the dessert, Richard didn't even interrupt his sentence to acknowledge me. He merely shifted his plate an inch to make room for the tart. "Mom," Julian said, looking up as he finished his 3rd glass of wine, "Beatrice said she's coming down tomorrow morning for the luncheon. Did you get her blouse sent out?" "I took care of it, Julian," I said, clearing his empty plate. "Great! She was throwing a fit about it. You know how she is." He leaned back, patting his stomach. "Excellent dinner, by the way. Though the beef could have used a touch more salt. You're losing your seasoning hand, Mom." "I'll remember that for next time," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. Next time. There would be no next time. I carried the dishes into the kitchen. I did not wash them. I left them stacked in the sink, the rich brown gravy drying into a hard crust on the Parisian porcelain. I walked out to the sunroom, pulled the door closed behind me, and sat in the dark, watching the tide pull the sea away from the shore, leaving the wet black stones bare in the moonlight. Saturday morning began with the sharp clatter of ceramic against marble. I was sitting in my usual spot in the sunroom, a cup of black tea in my hand, when I heard Clara's hurried footsteps in the kitchen. The door swung open and she stood in the frame, her hair perfectly styled in a smooth blowout, but her face tight with irritation. "Eleanor," she said, her voice pitched in that high, strained register she used when she was trying to sound pleasant but was actually furious. "Is everything okay? I went down to make coffee for Evelyn and Richard, and the sink is full of last night's dishes. The gravy has dried on the plates. I had to wash 2 mugs myself just so we could have a cup of coffee." I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warm porcelain rest against my fingers. I did not look up immediately. When I did, I gave her a small, vague smile.
"I'm so sorry, Clara," I said softly. My back was just so stiff after carrying those heavy suitcases up the stairs yesterday. I had to lie down early. I must have simply forgotten about the kitchen. Clara blinked, caught off guard. She wasn't used to me mentioning the labor she forced upon me, let alone using it as an excuse. "Well," she said, clearing her throat and crossing her arms, "Julian really should have helped with the bags. But still, we have 12 people coming at 1 o'clock for the luncheon. The caterers are arriving at 11 to set up the buffet, and the kitchen needs to be spotless. I can't have them working around dirty dishes." "Of course," I said, standing up slowly, letting my joints make a small, performative creak.
"I'll get right on it." "Thank you," she said, her tone instantly recovering its bossy, dismissive edge. "And while you're doing that, could you polish the sterling silver flatware, the set in the velvet-lined mahogany box in the dining room buffet? I want to use it for the luncheon. The stainless steel we used last night is just too ordinary for the women from the country club." "The silver," I repeated, keeping my voice empty of emotion. "Yes, of course." By 10 o'clock, Beatrice had arrived. She swept into the kitchen like a minor hurricane, smelling of expensive dry shampoo and gasoline from her drive down. She was wearing the cream silk blouse I had mailed her. It was slightly wrinkled at the hem, as if she had pulled it straight from the shipping box without ironing it. "Mom," she said, kissing the air near my ear, "finally! That shipping took forever. Why didn't you send it express? I had to go all the way to the post office downtown to sign for it because your courier didn't leave it with the front desk. It was such a nightmare. I almost didn't have it for my meeting on Thursday." "I'm sorry, Beatrice," I said, wiping a plate dry. "I went to the post office in town, and the young man behind the counter said standard mail would be just fine. I suppose I don't understand how these modern couriers work anymore." "Clearly," she sighed, pouring herself a cup of the coffee I had brewed. She didn't offer to help me with the mountain of dishes still left on the counter. "Anyway, is the patio ready? Clara said she wanted the white linen tablecloths on the outdoor tables. Did you iron them?" "I haven't had a chance yet, dear," I said. Beatrice rolled her eyes, a gesture she had perfected at 15 and never outgrew. "Mom, the guests will be here in 2 hours. What have you been doing all morning?" There is a quiet power in letting people believe their own lies about you. When they decide you are weak, they stop looking for your strength. When they convince themselves that you are slow, forgetful, and incapable, they stop watching your hands. I went into the dining room. The heavy mahogany buffet sat against the far wall, a beautiful piece of furniture Arthur had bought at an auction in Boston. Inside it, locked away, was the sterling silver flatware that had belonged to Arthur's grandmother. It was 72 pieces of solid silver, heavy and ornate, worth at least $6,000 in scrap metal alone, and far more as an heirloom. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the small, decorative brass key that unlocked the buffet door. I inserted it into the lock, turned it, and pulled the door open. The velvet-lined drawer where the silver box usually rested was empty. In its place was a small white index card. On it I had written in my neat librarian script, "Misplaced." I closed the buffet door, locked it, and put the key back in my pocket. 10 minutes later, Clara came into the dining room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. "Eleanor, did you find the silver? The caterers are setting up the tables now,
and they need to lay the place settings. I turned to her, my face a mask of mild, elderly distress. "Oh, Clara," I said, pressing a hand to my chest, "I am so terribly embarrassed. I went to open the buffet, but I can't find the key. I've looked everywhere, in the kitchen drawers, in the den, in my jewelry box. I just can't seem to remember where I put it." Clara's face went white. "What do you mean you lost the key? Eleanor, that flatware is worth thousands. It's locked in there?" "Yes, dear," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's safely locked away. But my mind, it's just like Julian said yesterday. I'm getting so forgetful. I must have put the key in a very safe place, but for the life of me, I can't recall where." "Julian!" Clara shrieked, her voice echoing through the hallway. "Julian, get in here! Your mother has lost the key to the silver."
Julian came rushing in, Richard close behind him, both of them holding glasses of iced tea. "What's going on?" Julian demanded, his brow furrowed. "Your mother," Clara hissed, pointing a manicured finger at the locked buffet. "She's lost the key. The sterling silver is locked inside, and the caterers are waiting. We're going to have to use the cheap stainless steel for the luncheon. In front of the president of the garden club, Julian." Julian looked at me, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of anger and that awful, patronizing pity. "Mom," he said, stepping toward me and putting a heavy hand on my shoulder, "this is what I was talking about. This is exactly what we discussed. Your memory is failing. You can't keep track of the basic things in this house anymore. It's not safe." "I know, Julian," I said, looking down at the floor, letting my shoulders slump. "I'm so sorry. I'm just so tired lately. The house is so big. It's so hard to keep track of everything." "It's fine," Julian said, though his voice was tight with rage. "We'll deal with it later. Richard, do you have a crowbar in your trunk? We might have to force the lock." "Don't you dare," I said, my voice dropping its frail tone for a split second, becoming cold and hard as iron. They both froze, looking at me in surprise. Julian and Richard both stared at me. For a second, the air in the dining room became incredibly still. The frail, apologetic old woman they had been patronizing had vanished, replaced by a stranger whose voice carried the cold, heavy weight of authority. I saw a flicker of genuine confusion in Julian's eyes, a brief, unsettling realization that he did not know the woman standing in front of him. I quickly pressed a hand to my collarbone, letting my eyelids flutter, and took a small, shaky breath. I lowered my voice back to its soft, trembling register. "It's just, Arthur loved this buffet so much," I whispered, letting a tear-like shine come into my eyes. "He spent 3 months restoring the finish on the doors. If you use a crowbar, Julian, you'll split the grain. The wood is antique. It can never be repaired. Please don't ruin his things just for a luncheon." The tension in Julian's shoulders broke, replaced by his usual expression of exasperated superiority. He sighed, shaking his head. "Jesus, Mom, you scared me," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, we won't break the lock. But look at the mess this is causing. Clara is in there practically having a panic attack because she has to use the everyday forks." "It's just stainless steel, Julian," I said softly, looking down at my apron. "They still feed people." "That's not the point, Eleanor," Clara snapped, stepping into the room.
She had heard the tail end of the conversation. Her face was flushed beneath her expensive makeup. The point is presentation. The women from the country club notice these things. They'll think we're struggling. We'll just tell them the silver is at the jeweler's, being professionally cleaned and polished for our upcoming family anniversary, Julian said, his legal mind quickly spinning a plausible lie. It makes us look thorough, not cheap. Clara's face cleared slightly. Yes, that works. But, Mom, you need to go change. The guests will be here in 20 minutes. You can't be walking around in that dirty apron, smelling like onions and dish soap. I'll go up to my room, I said. I'll stay out of your way. Actually, no, Clara said, stopping me with a raised hand. I need you to help the caterers plate the canapes. Just put on a clean blouse, not that old gray one, and try to look presentable. If anyone asks, you're just helping out because you love being in the kitchen. A servant who doesn't require a salary, I thought. Of course, Clara, I said. The luncheon was a master class in social theater. I stood in the kitchen, assembling tiny smoked salmon blinis, while the laughter of 12 wealthy women drifted in from the patio. Through the screen door, I could see Clara floating between the tables, her voice carrying that light, musical laugh she saved for people she wanted to impress. Beatrice was right beside her, holding a glass of Prosecco, talking to Mrs. Gable, the matriarch of the local historical society. I stepped closer to the screen door, holding a tray of clean glasses. "Oh, yes," Beatrice was saying, her voice loud enough to carry over the gentle breeze. "We're hoping to start the renovations in October. The layout of this place is so dated. We're going to knock down that awful old pantry and put in a modern glass conservatory. It's going to be absolutely stunning." "And your mother?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "Where will she go? She's been here so long." "Oh, we're looking at some lovely communities nearby," Beatrice said, not a hint of hesitation in her voice. "Somewhere much smaller, where she doesn't have to worry about the upkeep. She's just finding it all so overwhelming lately. Today, she actually lost the key to the family silver. We had to use the everyday flatware. It's sad, really, seeing them start to slip." Mrs. Gable nodded, her face polite but empty. "Yes, it's a difficult stage of life." The hardest part of playing a victim is knowing when to let them win the small battles so you can win the war. I felt no anger as I listened to my daughter discuss my mental decline with a stranger. I felt only a cold, arithmetic satisfaction. In exactly 28 days, the deed to this house would transfer to a corporation owned by the Chicago family. The contract was signed. The earnest money was already sitting in an escrow account. On the second Tuesday of September, a moving truck would arrive, paid for by the buyers, to pack up the mid-century furniture they had purchased. And my children, who were currently planning where to put their glass conservatory, would arrive to find the locks changed, the windows dark, and a new family sitting in the sunroom. I walked back to the kitchen counter to finish the glasses. I had left my phone sitting next to the knife block. As I reached for it, the screen lit up. It was a call from Marcus Vance. Before I could reach the phone, a hand swept past my shoulder and snatched it off the counter. I turned. Julian was standing there, his brow furrowed, staring at the screen where Marcus's name was flashing. "Why is Marcus Vance calling you on a Saturday afternoon, Mom?" Julian asked, his voice low and instantly suspicious. The phone continued to vibrate in Julian's hand, the quiet hum of its motor buzzing against his palm like an angry insect. He stared down at the screen, his fingers tightening around the casing. His legal training had made him hypervigilant, always looking for the hidden angle, the undisclosed asset, the threat of a competing interest. A thief is always the most suspicious of other people's pockets. Julian, who was actively planning to strip his mother of her home, was terrified that someone else might get to her resources first. "Why is Marcus Vance calling you, Mom?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, hard register that didn't carry into the living room. "He's been retired for 3 years. The only thing he handles now is his own private investments." I did not reach for the phone. I did not look panicked. I kept my hands resting on the edge of the marble counter, my posture soft, my eyes wide and slightly blank. "Oh," I said, letting a soft, fluttering sigh escape my lips. "Marcus's wife, Helen, is on the Historical Society committee with Mrs. Gable. You know how Helen is, Julian. She's been hounding me for months about those old photographs of the Cove from the 1950s. The ones your father took before the pier was rebuilt. I told her I'd look for them in the attic." I gestured vaguely toward the patio, where Mrs. Gable was currently laughing at one of Clara's jokes. "She must have had Marcus call me because she knew Mrs. Gable was coming down today," I added, my voice perfectly pitched with elderly innocence. "They're putting together a retrospective for the autumn gala." Julian looked from the phone to Mrs. Gable, then back to me. The explanation was logical, completely benign, and verified by the literal presence of the Historical Society president on my patio. His shoulders dropped half an inch, the defensive lawyer posture melting back into his usual condescending arrogance. "Here," he said, thrusting the phone toward me. "Answer it, but put it on speaker. If Helen is trying to get you to donate Arthur's original prints to the Society, I want to know about it. Some of those old negatives are worth money, Mom. We shouldn't just be giving them away for free." I took the phone, my fingers brushing his. His skin was warm and slightly damp from his iced drink. I pressed the green button and tapped the speaker icon, setting the phone down on the kitchen island between us. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice bright and slightly loud. "Hello! I was just telling Julian that I haven't had a chance to go up to the drafty attic to look for those 1950s photographs yet. I've had so much company this weekend." There was a brief, microscopic pause on the other end of the line. Marcus had practiced law for 45 years. He had cross-examined liars, negotiated multi-million-dollar settlements, and read the subtle shifts in human voice for a living. He heard my tone. He heard the use of his first name instead of the formal Mr. Vance. And he heard the word drafty attic, a phrase I had never used in my life. He understood instantly. "Ah, Eleanor," Marcus's gravelly voice came through the speaker, smooth and entirely unbothered. Of course, no rush at all. Helen was just nagging me to check in, since she knew you had the garden club ladies over today. Don't worry about the photographs right now. Enjoy your family. I'll give you a ring on Monday morning about, well, we can talk about the archives then." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, Give my best to Helen." "I will. Take care, Eleanor." The line clicked shut. Julian exhaled a short, dismissive breath, leaning back against the pantry door. "Good. Just make sure you don't promise them anything in writing, Mom. People like Helen Vance will take a mile if you give them an inch." "I'll be careful, Julian," I said, picking up my phone and sliding it back into my apron pocket. "And look," he continued, crossing his arms, "since we're on the subject of the future, Clara and I were talking. We've scheduled an architect to come down next Wednesday. His name is Robert Vance. No relation to Marcus, funny enough. He's the one who designed Clara's sister's cabin in Aspen. He's going to do some preliminary sketches of the sunroom and the pantry area." My heart gave a slow, cold thud. Next Wednesday. "An architect, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice small. "But I haven't agreed to any renovations, and I still live here." "Mom, it's just preliminary," Julian said, his voice taking on that loud, patient tone one uses with a stubborn child. "It takes months to get permits from the Coastal Commission anyway. We need to get the ball rolling now so we can start construction in the spring. Robert just needs about 2 hours to measure the rooms and check the load-bearing walls. You won't even have to do anything. Just let him in, show him around, and make him some tea." He didn't wait for my consent. He didn't ask if Wednesday was a good day for me. He simply informed me of the schedule, confident that my silence was, as always, his permission. "I see," I said, turning back to the sink. "Wednesday." "Great. I'll text you his arrival time," Julian said, patting my shoulder before turning to walk back out to the patio. "And seriously, Mom, try to get some rest. You look exhausted. It's really not good for your blood pressure to be stressing over things like keys and silver." I watched him go, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright coastal sun, as he stepped outside to join his wife and their wealthy friends. I looked down at the soap bubbles swirling in the drain of the kitchen sink. Next Wednesday. If an architect came to the house, he would take measurements. He would ask questions. He might notice the fresh structural inspection report that Thomas had submitted to the county database, a public record that any professional architect would pull before starting sketches. And if Julian saw that an inspection had been completed on my behalf, the entire house of cards would collapse before the 30-day escrow could close. I had 5 days. 5 days to ensure that when Robert Vance arrived on Wednesday morning, there would be nothing left for him to measure. Sunday evening arrived with the usual flurry of slammed doors, shouting, and the heavy rumble of Julian's SUV idling in the gravel driveway. I stood on the porch, my hands folded politely over my apron, watching them pack. They had left the house in a state of chaotic exhaustion. The kitchen counter was sticky with spilled Prosecco. The guest beds were stripped, the sheets left in tangled, damp piles on the floor, and the patio was littered with plastic cups and discarded napkins from Clara's garden club friends. "All right, Mom," Julian said, stepping up to the porch to give me a brief, perfunctory hug. He smelled of expensive cologne and the garlic bread I had made for lunch. "We're heading out. Remember, Robert Vance, the architect, will be here on Wednesday morning at 10. Make sure the sunroom is clear so he can get his measuring tape out. And don't worry about a thing. We're going to handle everything for you." "Drive safely, Julian," I said softly, my cheek resting for a second against his stiff collar. "See you, Eleanor," Clara called out from the passenger seat, already looking at her phone. Thanks for the food. It was great. Beatrice didn't even say goodbye. She had left an hour earlier in her own sports car, complaining that she had to beat the traffic to the city because she had an early Pilates class on Monday morning. I watched the red taillights of Julian's car fade down the road, the sound of the engine swallowed by the dull roar of the incoming tide. I walked back inside, closed the heavy oak door, and turned the brass key in the lock. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of an empty theater after the actors had gone home, leaving only the painted backdrops and the dust motes dancing in the stage lights. I went to my desk, pulled out my leather-bound calendar, and sat down. Today was Sunday. The architect was coming on Wednesday at 10 o'clock. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus Vance's private number. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping the soft, helpless tone I had used with Julian. "We have a problem. Julian has scheduled an architect to come to the house on Wednesday morning to take structural measurements for renovations." Marcus let out a low whistle. "He's moving fast. If an architect pulls the public records for the property, he'll see the structural inspection that was logged on Wednesday. Julian is a real estate lawyer, Eleanor. He'll connect the dots in 5 minutes." "Can we close early?" I asked. There was a silence on the other end, the sound of papers rustling. "The buyers are liquid, Eleanor. They've already deposited the full purchase price into the escrow account. They're actually chomping at the bit to take possession. They wanted to get some minor painting done before the winter storms start. If I call their attorney tonight, we can execute the final deed transfer tomorrow afternoon. The title company can record the sale first thing Wednesday morning." "What time?" "They open at 8:30. The recording usually takes about 15 minutes. By 8:45 on Wednesday morning, you will no longer be the legal owner of the orchard house. The Chicago family will hold the title." "And the keys?" "I'll have a courier deliver the new keys to the buyer's local representative on Wednesday at 9. Which means you have 48 hours to pack, Eleanor." I looked around the dark den, my eyes resting on the built-in bookshelves Arthur had built from salvaged barnwood. 42 years of marriage. 42 years of collecting books, framing photographs, storing letters, and holding on to the physical remnants of a life. We spend our lives gathering things to prove we exist, only to realize at the end that the most precious things are the ones that can fit in a single suitcase. "I don't need 48 hours, Marcus," I said quietly. "I'm leaving the furniture. I'm leaving the dishes. I only need to pack my clothes, my personal papers, and Arthur's journals. I can do that tomorrow." "Where will you go, Eleanor?" Marcus's voice was gentle, carrying the deep, protective concern of an old friend. "You can't just disappear into the night. Your children will look for you." "I'm not disappearing," I said, a cold, sharp smile touching my lips. "I'm relocating. I've rented a lovely little cottage on the north side of the bay. It's quiet, it has a view of the lighthouse, and the garden is small enough for me to tend myself without any help. I've already signed the lease, using the funds from the earnest money." "And Julian? Beatrice?" "They'll find out when the architect tries to open the front door on Wednesday morning," I said. The next morning, Monday, I began to pack. I did not use cardboard boxes. Julian had a tracker on my credit card, an account he had set up to help me manage my expenses. And if he saw a charge for a moving company or packing supplies, he would immediately call to investigate. Instead, I used 3 old canvas suitcases that had belonged to Arthur. They were sturdy, scuffed, leather-trimmed bags that had sat in the back of the attic closet for 20 years. I packed my clothes first, my practical wool sweaters, my sturdy walking shoes, my simple cotton blouses. I left behind the formal dresses Clara had bought me for family events, the ones that made me feel like an ornament she had selected to match her living room decor. On Tuesday afternoon, I went to Arthur's old roll-top desk in the corner of the den. It was the one place my children had never touched. They found the old desk dusty and full of junk. I pulled open the heavy oak timbre and began sorting through his journals. Arthur had kept a diary of the weather, the garden, and the tides for 30 years. As I reached for the final volume, the one from the year he died, a small white envelope slipped out from between the leather pages. On the front, in Arthur's strong, blocky print, was my name, Eleanor. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers trembled slightly as I slid my fingernail under the yellowed adhesive of the envelope. I pulled out a single sheet of lined paper, folded into 3. I unfolded it, the scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco, sweet cherry wood and cedar, still clinging faintly to the fibers of the paper. The letter was dated August 14th, 5 years ago, just 2 weeks before his heart finally gave out. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began. I sat down on Arthur's old leather desk chair, holding the single sheet of lined paper in hands that had suddenly gone cold. The ink was slightly faded, a dark blue ballpoint script I would recognize anywhere. "My dearest Eleanor," Arthur wrote. "If you are reading this, it means I have gone, and you are left alone in this big house we built together. I am so sorry I had to leave you first. My heart has been tired for a long time, but my mind has never been clearer than it is tonight as I write this. I have watched our children over the last few years, Eleanor. I have watched them when they think we aren't looking. I see the way Julian looks at this house, not with memories of his childhood, but with the calculations of a real estate lawyer. I see the way Beatrice treats you like a servant, demanding your time and your energy, while offering nothing but her absence in return. They are our children, and we loved them into existence, but they have developed the hunger of people who have never had to build anything of their own. They believe they are entitled to the fruit of our labor because they have never had to plant a seed. They are going to try to take this house from you, Eleanor. I know Julian's mind. He will try to convince you that you are weak, that you are old, that you cannot manage without him. He will use your love for him as a weapon against you. He will try to make you feel like a guest in your own home. Do not let them. You are the foundation of this family, Eleanor. You always have been. I was the one who worked the wood and laid the pipes, but you were the one who kept the air warm and the walls standing. If they treat you like a ghost, then show them what happens when the spirit leaves the house. If you must burn the bridge to keep yourself warm, do it with my full blessing. Sell the house, Eleanor. Take the money. Find a quiet place where you can watch the sea, and let them learn what it costs to live in a world without your grace. I have loved you since the day I met you on the ferry, and I will love you until the tide takes us both. Be strong, my girl. Your Arthur." I sat in the dimming afternoon light of the den, the letter resting in my lap.
A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped my eye and fell onto the page, soaking into the paper right next to his signature. I did not sob. I did not break down. The grief was there, yes, but it was a clean, sharp pain, like a knife cutting away a rotting branch. Arthur had seen it all. He had given me his blessing from beyond the grave. Any lingering doubt, any small, nagging voice of motherly guilt that had whispered in my ear during the long, sleepless nights was silenced forever. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of my cardigan, right next to the brass key. By Tuesday evening, the packing was finished. My 3 canvas suitcases sat by the kitchen island. The house looked exactly as it always did. The mid-century furniture was polished, the oak floors were clean, and the kitchen counter was clear. To anyone walking through the front door, it looked like a home waiting for its family to return for the weekend. But the soul of the house was gone. At 7 o'clock, a small, unmarked silver van pulled up the gravel driveway. Marcus's legal assistant, a quiet, polite young man named David, stepped out. He did not ask questions. He simply carried my 3 suitcases to the back of the van and opened the passenger door for me. I walked through the rooms one last time. I left the brass key to the front door sitting on the marble kitchen island, resting directly on top of the folded piece of paper I had found in Julian's room, the one detailing his plans for my capacity assessment and the costs of Harborview Manor. I did not leave a note. The paper was explanation enough. I walked out the front door, pulling it closed behind me, until I heard the heavy click of the latch. I did not look back as the van pulled down the driveway, the gravel crunching softly under the tires, carrying me away from the orchard house for the very last time. My new cottage was located on the north side of the bay, a quiet 2-bedroom stone house nestled among wild rosemary and sea lavender. It smelled of salt and scrubbed cedar. When David carried my bags inside and left, I sat on the small window bench in the living room, watching the yellow beam of the lighthouse sweep across the dark, undulating surface of the water. For the first time in 5 years, my chest felt light. I slept for 8 hours without waking once. Wednesday morning arrived with a bright, blinding sun that turned the bay into a sheet of hammered silver. I woke at my usual 6 o'clock. I made myself a cup of tea in a simple blue ceramic mug, sat on the porch of my new cottage, and watched the clock on my phone. 8:30. The title office in town opened. 8:45. Marcus Vance's assistant would be uploading the digital deed transfer to the county database. The $2.25 million would be cleared in my personal trust account, entirely out of Julian's legal reach. 10 o'clock. At the orchard house, Julian's SUV pulled up the driveway. I knew this because my phone, sitting on the small wooden table next to my tea, began to vibrate. It was Julian. I did not answer. I took a slow sip of my tea, watching a solitary gull glide on the wind currents above the water. 10:15. The phone vibrated again. Julian. 10:18. A text message appeared. Mom, where are you? The architect is here. We're standing on the porch. The door is locked, and you aren't answering your phone. Did you go to the market? Please call me back immediately. I set my tea down. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen,
and began to type my reply. I held the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen. The glass was warm from the morning sun. I typed a single, precise message. Julian, I am no longer at the house. I sold the property, and the transaction was recorded with the county at 8:30 this morning. The new owners have taken legal possession. Robert Vance will not need to measure the rooms. Your spare key will still work for the next few minutes. You will find the brass key on the kitchen island resting on top of the notes you left in the master guest room last weekend. I wish you well. I pressed send. The screen showed the little gray check marks, then delivered, then read. The silence of my new cottage seemed to deepen. Outside, the tide was gently rising, the small waves lapping against the stone seawall with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. I set the phone down on the wooden table. 2 minutes passed. The phone did not just vibrate, it erupted. Julian's name flashed across the screen. I did not pick it up. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Within 30 seconds, it began to ring again. This time it was Clara. I let it ring. Then Beatrice. I let it ring. They were calling in a panic, their comfortable, predictable world splintering in real time on the porch of the orchard house. I could picture the scene perfectly. Julian standing in his expensive leather shoes, his face flushed red with a mixture of anger and humiliation, trying to explain to Robert Vance, a prominent architect whose time cost hundreds of dollars an hour, why they couldn't get into the house. I could see Clara's eyes darting around the driveway, looking for my old sedan, her mind frantically trying to calculate the social embarrassment of having to cancel her autumn plans. When the phone rang for the 4th time, I slid the button to Do Not Disturb. The screen went dark, but the small blue notification light in the corner continued to blink, a tiny, rhythmic beacon of their desperation. I knew exactly what Julian's first legal instinct would be. He was a real estate attorney. He knew the law inside and out. The moment he walked into that empty house, saw the key, and read my text, his mind would pivot from shock to litigation. He would look up the recorded deed on his tablet. He would see the name of the purchasing corporation. And then he would try to void the contract. He would argue that his 72-year-old mother, living alone in a drafty house, was suffering from cognitive decline. He would cite my forgetfulness, the lost silver key, the unwashed dishes, the misplaced documents, as evidence that I lacked the mental capacity to execute a multi-million-dollar property sale. He would try to prove that the off-market buyers had exploited a vulnerable, grieving widow. He would try to declare me incompetent. But Marcus Vance was not just Arthur's old friend. He was a master of his craft. He had spent 40 years protecting the assets of old money families from their own offspring. He had seen this exact play 100 times before. When greedy children lose their leverage, they do not look for their own mistakes. They look for a way to prove you were never allowed to win. They will call you crazy before they call themselves cruel. On Tuesday morning, before I signed a single closing document, Marcus had arranged a meeting for me at his office. But it wasn't a meeting with the buyers. It was a meeting with Dr. Evelyn Aris, a renowned, board-certified geriatric psychiatrist and cognitive specialist from the State University. For 3 hours, Dr. Aris had put me through a battery of rigorous cognitive examinations. We did memory tests, spatial reasoning exercises, logic puzzles, and neurological reflex checks. She had asked me about my finances, my daily routine, my late husband, and my reasons for selling the house. I had answered every question with absolute, crystalline clarity. I had explained, calmly and logically, that my children were treating my home like a free resort, that they were planning to relocate me against my will, and that I wished to liquidate my primary asset to secure my own independent future. At the end of the evaluation, Dr. Aris had smiled, shaken my hand, and signed a 3-page notarized affidavit. The document declared me to be in perfect cognitive health, possessing exceptional mental clarity, and fully capable of managing my own legal, financial, and personal affairs. A copy of that affidavit had been attached to the closing files, sealed and registered with the title company, and another copy was currently sitting in Marcus Vance's fireproof safe. Julian's trap had been dismantled before he even knew he was walking into it. The blue notification light on my phone flashed again. I picked it up. There was a voicemail from Julian. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to his voice, no longer smooth, no longer condescending, but wild, cracked, and breathless with rage. "Mom!" he shouted, the sound of the coastal wind howling in the background. "What the hell have you done? Are you out of your mind? You sold the house for $2 million to some corporate shell? You can't do this. You don't have the authority to just sell our family home. The architect is standing right here. Clara is hysterical. Mom, pick up the phone right now. We are coming to find you." I listened to the message to the very end. "We are coming to find you," he had said. But they couldn't. They did not know about the cottage on the north side of the bay. They did not know about my new phone number, which Marcus had set up for me on Tuesday afternoon. They did not even know the license plate of my car, because I had traded my old sedan for a small, reliable crossover on Monday morning, paying the difference in cash. To them, I had simply vanished into the salt air, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and the keys to their own greed. I deleted the voicemail, set the phone back down, and picked up my book. The grandfather clock in the hallway of my new cottage chimed 11 times. It was a smaller clock, a simple pine piece I had bought at a local shop, but its tick was steady, clean, and entirely mine. The next 4 days were the quietest I had known in 20 years. I established a new, simple routine in my cottage by the lighthouse. I woke early, made my tea, and sat on the small stone patio, watching the morning light color the salt marshes a pale, dusty pink. In the afternoons, I walked down the narrow gravel path to the beach, collecting smooth gray stones and pieces of sea glass that had been worn down by decades of relentless waves. I did not check my old phone. It sat in a kitchen drawer, turned off, a cold piece of plastic and glass that no longer had the power to disrupt my peace. But I was not naive. I knew that Julian, Clara, and Beatrice would not simply accept their defeat and slip away. When people have spent years treating another human being as a resource, they do not react to the loss of that resource with grief. They react with the frantic, clawing anger of a landlord whose tenant has stopped paying rent. They would try to find me. And when they couldn't find me, they would try to force me out of hiding. On Monday morning, a call came through on my new phone, the one only Marcus Vance and my bank had the number for. It was Sheriff Miller. He was a sensible man in his late 50s who had known Arthur for 30 years, back when they used to fish for striped bass off the old pier. "Eleanor," Sheriff Miller said, his tone warm but professional, "I'm just calling to let you know your son Julian came into the station this morning. He was in quite a state. He wanted to file a missing person report. He claimed you'd been abducted or that you were having some kind of mental breakdown and had fled your home." I took a slow breath, looking out at the bay where a small fishing boat was cutting through the morning fog. "I appreciate you calling, Tom," I said quietly. "I assume you handled it?" "Of course," Miller chuckled, a low, dry sound. "I told him we don't file missing person reports for 72-year-old women who drive their own cars, sign their own legal documents, and have already come into the station to notify the sheriff of their voluntary relocation." On Monday afternoon, before leaving the Orchard House for the last time, I had stopped by the county sheriff's office. I had sat down with Tom Miller, handed him a copy of my cognitive assessment from Dr. Aris, and explained that I was selling my house and moving to a private location. I had warned him that my children, unhappy with the sale, might try to use the police to track me down or harass me under the guise of a wellness check. A manipulator's concern is always a searchlight in disguise. They do not want to make sure you are safe. They want to make sure you are still within their reach. "Julian wasn't happy," Miller continued. "He started throwing around legal terms, talking about filing petitions and contacting the state board. I told him he was welcome to file whatever he liked, but as far as the county sheriff was concerned, Eleanor, you are a private citizen living your life, and he needs to stop wasting our department's resources." "Thank you, Tom," I said. "I owe you a cup of coffee." "Any time, Eleanor. Give my best to Arthur's memory." I hung up feeling a small sense of victory, but it was short-lived. On Tuesday afternoon, a car pulled up the gravel driveway of my new cottage. It wasn't the silver van Marcus's assistant drove, and it wasn't Julian's SUV. It was a modest, dark blue sedan. Marcus Vance stepped out of the driver's side. He walked slowly up the stone path, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cool wind off the bay. He looked older than he had last week. The sharp, lively spark in his eyes was clouded with a heavy, exhausted shadow. I opened the door before he could knock. "Marcus," I said, stepping aside to let him in, "what's happened?" He didn't answer immediately. He walked into my small living room, set his leather briefcase down on the wooden table, and sank into the armchair with a long, heavy sigh. "Julian is a vicious boy, Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice gravelly and tired. "He's not his father. Arthur had a temper, but he had a code. Julian only has a license to practice law, and he's using it like a butcher's knife." "What did he do?" I asked, setting a mug of hot tea down on the table beside him. Marcus rubbed his face with his hands. "He didn't try to challenge the sale of the house. He knows Dr. Aris's assessment is ironclad, and the Chicago buyers have a legal team that would tie him up in court for 10 years. So he went after me instead." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick white document, setting it on top of the mahogany table. "Julian has filed a formal petition in probate court to have me stripped of my license to practice law," Marcus said quietly. "He's accusing me of elder exploitation, legal malpractice, and conflict of interest. He's claiming that I used my historical relationship with Arthur to manipulate a vulnerable widow into selling her primary asset below market value so that my firm could collect a massive transaction fee. I stared at the document. The words Vance and Associates and exploitation of vulnerable adult stood out in bold black ink. "But that's a lie," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, dangerous whisper. "The house sold for $2.2 million. That is 20% above the appraised market value for the Cove. And your firm didn't even take a standard commission. You only charged me the basic filing fees." "It doesn't matter if it's a lie, Eleanor," Marcus said, looking up at me with tired, pale eyes. "In our profession, an accusation like this is a death sentence. The state bar has to investigate. They'll freeze my accounts, they'll audit my files, and they'll drag my name through the mud in every legal journal in the state. I'm 75, Eleanor. I wanted to spend my retirement fishing and teaching my grandson how to sail. Now I'm going to spend the next 2 years defending my honor in front of a disciplinary committee." He paused, his hand resting on the legal petition. "Julian called my office this morning," Marcus whispered. "He told my secretary to give me a message. He said he would drop the petition and the civil suit immediately, on one condition." I looked at my old friend, the man who had helped me escape my cage, the man who was now paying the price for my freedom. "What condition?" I asked. "He wants your new address, Eleanor, and he wants you to sign over power of attorney to him. He said if you don't comply by Friday at 5 o'clock, he's going to ruin me." I stared at the thick, white legal petition sitting on my small mahogany table. The steam from Marcus's tea rose between us, a thin, wavering curtain in the quiet room. A mother will endure almost any wound to her own flesh. She will tolerate the neglect. She will swallow the insults. And she will carry the heavy, silent burden of her children's greed for decades. But she will become a creature of pure bone and iron the moment you try to destroy the innocent people who helped her survive. Julian had crossed a boundary from which there was no return. He was no longer just a selfish child. He had become a predator, willing to ruin a good man's life and career to force his mother back into a cage. "Eleanor," Marcus said, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his mug. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought this to your door. You've worked so hard to find this peace. I'll hire a defense firm. I'll fight him. It's going to take everything I have." "You won't fight him, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, cool, and absolute. "And you won't surrender." Marcus looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Then what do we do? If I don't give him your address by Friday, he'll file the formal complaint with the state bar. Once that engine starts, Eleanor, it doesn't stop." I stood up, walked to the small built-in closet in the hallway, and retrieved my handbag. I pulled out a heavy, secure key with a blue plastic tab, the key to my safety deposit box at the county bank downtown. I set the key on the table next to Julian's petition. "Marcus," I said, sitting back down, "do you remember the summer before Arthur died? The year Julian bought that expensive vacation home in the mountains? The one Clara insisted they needed for networking?" Marcus frowned, his legal mind searching his memory. "Yes, I remember. I was surprised at the time. Julian's firm is prestigious, But he was only a junior partner then. I wondered how he managed the down payment. Arthur told me Julian had secured a private investment, but he was very vague about it. Arthur was vague because he was protecting our son from a federal prison sentence, I said quietly. Marcus set his tea down, his eyes widening. Julian didn't have a private investor, I continued, looking out the window at the gray waves rolling onto the shore. He tried to get a bridge loan from the merchant bank in the city, but his debt-to-income ratio was too high. He needed a co-signer with substantial liquid assets. He asked Arthur. Arthur refused. He told Julian that we had worked too hard for our retirement to risk it on a luxury mountain house. I took a deep breath, the memory of that terrible summer heavy in my chest. So Julian did what he always does when he doesn't get what he wants. He took it anyway. He forged his father's signature on a $400,000 home equity line of credit against the orchard house. He used our home, the house Arthur had spent 40 years building, as collateral for his vacation property. Marcus gasped, a soft, horrified sound.
My God, Eleanor, that's bank fraud. It's grand larceny. It's forgery.
Yes, I said, and Arthur discovered it 3 weeks later, when a statement from the bank arrived in the mail. He was devastated, Marcus. I had never seen him cry like he did that night. He wanted to go to the police, but I begged him not to. I was a mother, Marcus. I was weak. I wanted to protect my boy's future. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing Julian's mugshot on the news. I pointed to the safety deposit key on the table. Arthur agreed to pay off the line of credit using his personal life insurance annuity, but he made sure we had insurance of our own. He hired a forensic handwriting analyst, the best in the state, to do a full certified comparison of the forged signature against Julian's actual handwriting. The report is 50 pages long, completely conclusive, and notarized. And Arthur made Julian write a full handwritten confession, detailing exactly how he did it, when he did it, and how much he stole, in exchange for us not reporting him to the state bar and the district attorney. Marcus stared at the blue-tabbed key, his breath coming in shallow, quick gasps. And you have those documents? The forensic report? The handwritten confession? They are in my safety deposit box, I said, along with the original forged loan application Julian filed with the bank. Eleanor, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. If those documents are released, Julian won't just lose his license to practice law. The statute of limitations on bank fraud in this state is 6 years. The forgery happened 5 years ago. He could go to prison. I know, I said. A cold, heavy silence settled over the room. I was his mother. I had carried him inside my body. I had taught him how to walk, how to read, how to tie his shoes. I have spent decades cleaning his messes and protecting his reputation from his own arrogance. But a mother is not a permanent shield. She is a teacher. And if her child refuses to learn the lessons of kindness, of decency, of basic human respect, then he must learn the lessons of the law. What do you want to do, Eleanor? Marcus asked, his voice filled with a deep, solemn respect. I want you to go to the bank tomorrow morning, Marcus, I said, sliding the key across the table toward him. Retrieve the folder. Make 3 copies of the confession letter and the executive summary of the forensic report. I looked down at the mug of tea, the liquid calm and dark. On Thursday morning, I want you to have a courier deliver one of those copies to Julian's private office. No legal threats, no long letters from your firm, Just a simple one-line note from me. "What will the note say?" Marcus asked. I looked him in the eye, my face free of anger, free of hesitation, cold as the sea. "It will say, withdraw the petition against Marcus by 5 o'clock on Thursday, or the original folder goes to the district attorney on Friday morning. Love, Mom." Thursday morning arrived with a cold, low-hanging mist that seemed to press down on the bay, turning the water into a dull, leaden sheet. I sat by my kitchen window, a simple cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, watching the grandfather clock in the living room. 9:15. Marcus had gone to the bank the moment the doors opened at 8:30. By now, he would have retrieved the heavy, blue-tabbed folder from the safety deposit box. He would have seen the meticulousness of Arthur's insurance policy, the clean white pages of the forensic report, the sharp, jagged lines of Julian's signature compared to Arthur's elegant, old-school cursive, and the final, devastating page. 3 sheets of yellow pad paper written in Julian's own hand, confessing to the forgery, the bank fraud, and the theft. By 10 o'clock, the courier would be walking into the glass and steel lobby of Julian's law firm downtown. I knew Julian's schedule. On Thursday mornings, he held his weekly case review with the junior associates. He liked to sit at the head of the long mahogany conference table, drinking espresso from a delicate porcelain cup, delivering sharp, biting critiques of their research, while Clara's sister's brother-in-law, or some other country club connection, nodded in approval. He loved the theater of authority. He loved making young lawyers sweat. But at 10:15, his secretary would knock on the door. She would hand him a heavy cardboard courier envelope marked "Confidential," to be opened by addressee only. He would open it, expecting a deposition or a contract. Instead, he would see his own shaky 5-year-old handwriting staring back at him. He would see the words, "I, Julian Vance, hereby confess that on June 12th, I forged my father's signature." The clock ticked on. 11 o'clock, 12:30, 3 o'clock. I did not pace. I did not bite my nails. I sat in my small armchair, a book resting unopened in my lap, watching the gray fog slowly drift across the glass of the window. A spoiled child only understands the value of a boundary when they crash into it at full speed. For 35 years, Julian had lived in a world where his actions had no permanent consequences, where his mother always cleaned up the broken glass, and his father's money always paved over the potholes of his greed. He had forgotten that the world does not operate on motherly love. At 4:15, my phone began to vibrate on the side table. It was Marcus's private line. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. "Hello, Marcus." "Eleanor," Marcus said. His voice was breathless, carrying a strange, vibrating energy. "He's here. He drove down from the city. He's sitting in my office right now. He looks like he's aged 10 years in 5 hours, Eleanor. He's completely white. He's shaking." "Did he withdraw the petition?" I asked. "He signed the formal withdrawal papers 10 minutes ago," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've already had my secretary file them electronically with the state bar and the probate court. The case is dismissed. It's over. But Eleanor, he's begging to speak to you. He won't leave my office until he hears your voice. I told him I wouldn't give him your address, but do you want me to put him on speaker? I looked at the small pine grandfather clock in the hallway. 4:18. Put him on, I said. There was a brief clatter of the phone being moved, the sound of a chair scraping against the floorboards, and then a heavy, ragged sigh came through the speaker. Mom? Julian's voice was cracked, thin, and entirely stripped of the loud, arrogant confidence he had used on my porch last weekend. He sounded like a frightened teenager. Mom, are you there? I am here, Julian, I said, keeping my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of anger. Mom, please, he sobbed, a wet, desperate sound that carried no dignity. How could you do this to me? How could you hold this over my head? It was 5 years ago. Dad forgave me. We paid it back. Your father did not forgive you, Julian, I said, each word a cold, precise stone falling into the silence of the room. He paid your debt so your mother wouldn't have to see her only son in a federal jumpsuit. He did it to protect our name, not your character. And you repaid his sacrifice by trying to steal his home, treat his widow like an unpaid servant, and ruin his best friend's life. I'm sorry, Julian cried, his voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. I'm sorry, Mom. I was desperate. Clara, she wanted that house, and my billable hours were down, and I was just trying to secure our family's future. I didn't mean to hurt Marcus. I've withdrawn the petition. It's gone. I swear to God I'll never touch Marcus again. I know you won't, I said. Mom, please, he whispered, his breathing shallow and rapid. The original files, the confession, the forensic report. You have to give them to me. If those go to the district attorney, my career is finished. I'll lose my partnership. I'll lose my home. Clara will leave me, Mom. The kids, they won't even be able to look at me. Please, you're my mother. You can't destroy my life. I looked out at the ocean, the fog finally starting to break, revealing a thin line of cold blue water on the horizon. I am not going to give you the folder, Julian, I said softly. The line went dead quiet. I could hear his sharp, panicked inhalation through the speaker. What? He whispered. But I did what you wanted. I withdrew the petition. You said... I said if you didn't withdraw it, I would send the folder to the district attorney on Friday morning, I corrected him. You withdrew it, so the folder stays in the safety deposit box. For now. For now? Julian's voice rose, a sharp edge of terror cutting through his exhaustion. You're keeping it? For now? Julian's voice rose to a thin, panicked shriek through the speaker. You're keeping it? Mom, you can't. That's blackmail. You're holding my life hostage. I am not holding your life hostage, Julian, I said, my voice as cool and clean as the coastal wind. I am simply keeping the fence closed. As long as that folder remains in my safety deposit box, you will be the son I always hoped you would be. You will be polite, you will be quiet, you will manage your own debts, and most importantly, you will never, under any circumstances, attempt to touch my life, my assets, or my friends again. And if I don't, he whispered, his voice trembling. Then the fence opens, I replied simply, and your partnership, your license, and your freedom go with it. The choice, Julian, has always been yours. You forged the signature. I merely kept the pen.
There was a long, ragged silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing, the soft, defeated sound of a man who had finally realized that the woman he thought was a shadow was actually the anchor holding him to the earth. "I understand," he whispered, the fight completely gone from his voice. He sounded hollow, a shell of the proud lawyer who had stood on my porch only 5 days ago. "Goodbye, Julian," I said. I tapped the screen, ending the call. I set the phone down on the table, took a deep breath, and picked up my mug of chamomile tea. It was still warm. The fog outside had completely dissipated now, leaving the bay bright, blue, and open under the late afternoon sun. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times. The deadline Julian had set for Marcus's ruin had passed. But Marcus was safe, his retirement was secure, and the keys to my life were firmly in my own hands. But a family is a complex, tangled web. When you pull one thread, the rest of the structure vibrates. Julian was the legal mind of their little operation, but he was not the only one who felt entitled to the fruits of my life. By Friday morning, the silence of my cottage was broken again. This time it wasn't a call. It was a barrage of text messages from Beatrice. Julian had clearly gone back to the city and told his sister and his wife what had happened. He had likely left out the part about the forgery and his own blackmail. His pride would never allow him to admit he had been brought to his knees by his mother. But he had delivered the central, devastating truth. The orchard house was gone. The sale was legal, and I had the money. "Mom, how could you?" Beatrice's first text read. "You sold our childhood home without telling us? You let some corporate buyers lock us out?" Clara had to pay a $3,000 cancellation fee to the architect. 10 minutes later, another text arrived. "I know you sold it for over $2 million, Mom." Julian told me. "That money isn't just yours. It's family money. Dad built that house for all of us. I have $50,000 in credit card debt from my boutique launch, and Clara needs to pay off her country club dues. You need to distribute our inheritance now. It's only fair." I sat on my porch reading the messages on my screen. Greedy children believe a mother's savings are just an early inheritance they have been temporarily denied. They look at her bank account like a countdown, waiting for the day they can finally divide the spoils of her sacrifice. Beatrice had always been the golden child. She was 38 years old, but she still lived like a college student with an unlimited allowance, constantly launching boutiques that failed within 6 months, buying designer clothes she couldn't afford, and expecting her brother or her mother to cover the deficit. I did not reply to her texts. I went inside, made myself a light breakfast of poached eggs and toast, and sat by the window. At noon, the phone rang. It was Beatrice's number. I decided to answer. I needed to cut the final thread. "Hello, Beatrice," I said quietly. "Mom!" she screamed into the receiver, her voice high-pitched and hysterical. "Why have you been ignoring my texts? Do you have any idea what we've been through this week? Clara is in tears. Julian is locked in his study, refusing to talk to anyone. And you're just sitting somewhere enjoying your millions? It's sick, Mom. It's financial abuse." "Financial abuse," I repeated, a small, dry laugh escaping my throat. "Beatrice, I am 72 years old. I spent 40 years cooking your meals,
washing your clothes, paying your debts, and maintaining a 5-bedroom house so you and your friends could use it as a free hotel. I have given you my youth, my energy, my peace, and my home. I do not owe you an inheritance. My life is not an estate sale." "You selfish old woman!" Beatrice shouted, her voice shaking with rage.
"You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you can just cut us off and live like a queen in some secret hideout. Well, let me tell you something." She paused, her breath coming in sharp, venomous gasps. "If you don't transfer $500,000 to my account by Monday morning, you will never see Leo and Maya again. I'll make sure Clara never lets them near you. You'll die alone in that secret little house of yours, Eleanor. Your grandchildren won't even know your name." I looked down at the small silver frame resting on the wooden side table next to my armchair. It was a photograph of Leo and Maya, taken 3 summers ago on the beach behind the orchard house. They were smiling, their skin golden from the sun, but even then their eyes were not directed at the camera. They were looking past me, toward the ice cream stand on the boardwalk where their father was standing. When children weaponize their own offspring, they forget that a grandmother's love is not a blind, helpless instinct. It is a choice. And you cannot successfully withhold what you have already been forced to let go. "Beatrice," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and entirely free of the panic she was so desperate to hear. "You cannot lock a door that was never open." The line went quiet for a second, the sound of her heavy, ragged breathing the only noise through the receiver. What does that mean?" she muttered, her tone faltering. "It means," I said, "that during the last 3 years, Leo and Maya have visited my home 20 times. Not once did they ask me how my joints were. Not once did they sit with me on the porch to talk about their school or their lives. When I tried to speak to Maya, she rolled her eyes, put her headphones on, and walked out of the room. When I made Leo his favorite dinner, he complained that the ingredients weren't the expensive organic ones his mother buys in the city, and left his plate full on the table. You and Clara have spent a decade teaching those children to look through me instead of at me. They do not see me as a grandmother, Beatrice. They see me as the resident concierge of a free resort." "They're teenagers, Mom," Beatrice screamed, trying to claw her way back to her position of moral outrage. "That's just how kids are." "No," I said softly. "That is how your kids are, because they learned it from you. They learned that I am a resource to be used, an invisible support system that requires no gratitude. You cannot threaten me with their absence when they have been completely absent, even while sitting at my dining table." You cold, heartless bitch," Beatrice whispered, her voice shaking with a terrifying, childish rage. "You really don't care about us at all, do you?" "I cared enough to give you 42 years of my life, Beatrice," I said, my voice remaining level and calm. "But that is enough. I will not be transferring $500,000 to your account. Not on Monday. Not ever. The money from the sale has been placed in an irrevocable private trust. It is completely out of your reach and the reach of Julian's creditors. When I pass,
The remainder of the funds will go directly to the children's hospital in the city, the one that saved your life when you had meningitis at age 6. A debt you seem to have forgotten, but I have not. Mom! Goodbye, Beatrice, I said. I hung up. I did not block her number. I simply set the phone back down on the side table, right next to the silver frame of the grandchildren. I picked up the frame, turned it face down on the polished wood, and walked into the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. The split was clean. The boundaries were set. But greed is an unstable element. It does not sit quietly in a corner when it is denied. It morphs, taking on new, desperate shapes. Julian was paralyzed by the forgery confession, and Beatrice was blinded by her own tantrums. But there was still Clara. Clara was a woman whose entire identity was built on the fragile scaffolding of social standing. She was the secretary of the country club garden committee. She was the woman who boasted to her wealthy friends about the family estate on the cove. The loss of the orchard house was not just a financial blow to her. It was a social execution. And Clara did not know about the forgery confession folder. Julian, too terrified and too proud to admit his criminal past to his wife, had simply told her that the sale was legal, that I had won, and that they had to let it go. But Clara was not a woman who let things go. On Saturday morning, my phone rang again. It was Marcus. When I answered, I heard a sound I hadn't heard from him in weeks, a quiet, dry chuckle. "Eleanor," Marcus said, his gravelly voice filled with amusement, "you aren't going to believe this. The theater has entered a new act." "What has Clara done, Marcus?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "She's hired a low-grade, aggressive billboard attorney from the city, a man named Stanley Vance, no relation to me, thank God," Marcus said. "She's filed a formal lis pendens against the orchard house on behalf of her children, Leo and Maya. She's claiming that Arthur's original estate trust contained a clause stating the property could not be sold without the consent of the ultimate heirs, which she claims includes her children." I frowned. "But Arthur's trust didn't contain any such clause. You drafted it yourself, Marcus. The title was entirely in my name." "Of course it didn't," Marcus laughed. "The suit is completely frivolous. Any judge will throw it out in 5 minutes. But Clara doesn't care about winning a long legal battle. She wants to freeze the property. A lis pendens places a cloud on the title, which means the Chicago buyers can't start their renovations or secure their permits until the lawsuit is resolved. Clara thinks she can harass the new owners into walking away from the contract so she can force you to take the house back." I stood quiet for a second, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in my mind. "And Julian?" I asked. "How does Julian feel about his wife filing a lawsuit over the title?" "Julian is in a state of absolute clinical terror," Marcus whispered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "He called me 10 minutes ago, sobbing, Eleanor, literally sobbing, because he knows that if Clara's lawsuit goes to court, the buyer's legal team won't just file a motion to dismiss. They'll demand a full forensic audit of the property's title history to prove the sale was clean. And during that audit, the title company will have to produce the records of the $400,000 home equity line of credit from 5 years ago." I closed my eyes, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "The forgery," I whispered. "Exactly," Marcus said. "Clara's greedy little lawsuit is going to drag Julian's bank fraud straight into the light of day. He's begging me to help him stop her, but he can't tell her why she has to stop without confessing to her that he's a criminal who forged his father's signature. He's caught between his wife's greed and his own prison sentence." I stood by the window of my small kitchen, holding my blue ceramic mug, watching the steam curl slowly into the cool air. On the side table, the silver frame of my grandchildren remained turned face down, its dark felt back a silent, square monument to a boundary that would never be crossed again. Arrogance is a blindfold that makes you believe you are holding a sword when you are actually holding the blade. Clara had spent years believing she was the architect of her family's social ascendancy. She had managed Julian's career, curated their friendships, and demanded the luxury mountain home and the country club membership because she believed she was entitled to a life of effortless prestige. Now, her own blind greed had led her to construct a gallows for her husband, and she was cheerfully pulling the lever. "Eleanor," Marcus's voice came through the receiver, carrying a quiet, gravelly warmth. "The buyer's legal representation is prepared to file a motion to dismiss Clara's lawsuit on Tuesday morning. They've asked us for an affidavit confirming that Arthur's trust contained no restriction on the sale. I can sign it myself, and you can sign it as the sole trustee. It will end the lawsuit instantly." "But if we sign it," I said, "does the title audit still happen?" "No," Marcus explained. "If we file the affidavit and the court dismisses the case, the cloud on the title is cleared, and the escrow proceeds normally. The forgery remains locked in our safety deposit box. But if we don't file the affidavit, if we let Clara's lawyer push this to a preliminary hearing, the buyer's title insurance company will step in. They will conduct a full forensic title audit to protect their investment. And once they do, Julian's 5-year-old bank fraud is a matter of public record." I took a slow sip of my coffee, the dark, bitter liquid warming my throat. "Call Julian, Marcus," I said quietly. "Tell him he has until Monday morning at 10 o'clock to have his wife withdraw the lis pendens and the lawsuit. Tell him that if the paperwork isn't filed with the court by 10, we will not submit the affidavit. We will let the title audit proceed, and I will personally deliver the confession letter to the district attorney's office at 11. "He'll do it, Eleanor," Marcus said. "He has no choice. But I don't think he's going to be able to stop Clara without telling her why. She's too stubborn, and she's already bragging to her friends about protecting her children's heritage." "Then he will have to tell her," I said. "It is time for Julian to clean his own house." The weekend passed in a state of profound, beautiful stillness. The fog rolled in on Saturday night, wrapping my small stone cottage in a thick, protective blanket of white, before clearing on Sunday morning to reveal a sky so blue it looked like polished glass. I spent the hours reading, walking along the rocky shore, and tending to the small pots of rosemary and thyme I had placed on the windowsill. I did not think about the storm raging in the city. I did not picture the screaming matches that were undoubtedly echoing through the high ceilings of Julian and Clara's luxury apartment, or the cold, petrifying terror that was keeping my son awake at 3 a.m, watching the clock tick down to his own destruction. They had built their lives on a foundation of sand, made of stolen money, forged signatures, and the exploited labor of an old woman. Now the tide was coming in. On Monday morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It wasn't Marcus. It was Clara's number. I set my coffee cup down, picked up the phone, and slid the button to answer. "Hello, Clara." "Eleanor," Clara said. Her voice was sharp, brittle, and vibrating with an aggressive, desperate energy. She was trying to sound dominant, but I could hear the faint, hollow tremor of fear beneath her words. "I'm calling because we need to put an end to this ridiculous circus. Stanley Vance says our lawsuit is incredibly strong. The buyers are already panicking because their architects can't get the permits to start work." "Is that so?" I said, keeping my voice soft, empty, and polite. "Yes, it is," Clara snapped. "But Julian is having some kind of panic attack. He's been locked in his study all weekend.
He's practically hysterical, begging me to drop the suit. I don't know what kind of psychological hold you have over your son, Eleanor, but it stops today. We are prepared to withdraw the lawsuit, but it's going to cost you." "Cost me?" "We want $500,000, Clara demanded, her voice rising to a shrill, triumphant pitch. "We want it transferred to a trust account for Leo and Maya by noon today. If you do that, I'll have Stanley withdraw the filing and you can have your precious sale. If you don't, we will push this all the way to a trial. We'll drag your name through every court in the county. We'll show everyone what kind of grandmother you really are, leaving your own flesh and blood with nothing while you run off with millions." She paused, waiting for me to gasp, to plead, to offer her a compromise. She was a woman who believed that every human being had a price, and that she was the one who set the market. I looked out at the ocean, a solitary sailboat drifting lazily on the horizon, completely free of the shore. "Clara," I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper that seemed to freeze the air in the room, "you are a very foolish woman." "What did you say?" she hissed. "I said you are foolish," I repeated. "You are standing on a mountain of dry grass, holding a lit match, and demanding that I pay you for the privilege of burning down your own house. I will not be transferring $500,000 to you. Not today, not ever." "Then we'll see you in court, Eleanor." "Before you hang up, Clara," I interrupted, my voice as heavy and sharp as an iron gate, "I suggest you hang up, walk down the hallway of your beautiful apartment, and ask your husband a very simple question." There was a brief, tense silence on the other end of the line. "What question?" Clara muttered, her tone suddenly defensive. "Ask him," I said, "where he got the $400,000 down payment for your luxury mountain home 5 years ago. And then ask him why he spent the last 48 hours throwing up in your master bathroom." The line was quiet for a long, heavy second. I could hear Clara's sharp, shallow breathing through the speaker, the sound of her manicured fingers tightening around her phone. Her silence was not the silence of contemplation. It was the petrified, frozen stillness of a woman who had suddenly realized the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. What are you talking about, Eleanor?" she whispered, her voice stripped of its sharp, arrogant edge. "What down payment?" "You have exactly 54 minutes, Clara," I said, my voice as calm and unyielding as the winter sea.
If the formal withdrawal of the lawsuit and the lis pendens is not electronically filed by 10 o'clock, we will not submit the affidavit. The title audit will begin, the banks will pull the records, and I will personally deliver Julian's handwritten confession to the district attorney's office. Go talk to your husband, Clara. Ask him why he's ruined you. I hung up. I did not wait for her response. I set the phone face down on the kitchen island, right next to the brass key I had left there a week ago, which had now been replaced by the quiet, polished surface of my new mahogany table. I sat down on the window bench, pulling my wool cardigan tight around my shoulders. Outside, the tide was coming in, the gray, foaming waves cresting over the black rocks of the cove. The pine grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a slow, heavy rhythm. 9:15, 9:30, 9:45. I watched the brass minute hand creep toward the 12. I felt no anxiety. I felt no malice. I felt only the deep, solemn peace of a woman who had finally stepped out of the path of a storm she had spent 40 years trying to prevent. My children had chosen their own paths. They had sown the seeds of their own destruction, and now they were harvesting the crop. At 9:58, the phone began to vibrate on the table. I picked it up. It was Marcus. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was breathless, carrying a strange, vibrating mixture of relief and awe. "It's done. The formal withdrawal was just filed with the probate court and the county registrar. Clara's attorney signed it, and Clara signed it herself. The lawsuit is dismissed. The cloud on the title is completely cleared." I closed my eyes, letting out a long, slow breath. "Thank you, Marcus." "But Eleanor, Julian called my secretary," Marcus whispered, his voice dropping to a low, quiet murmur. "He was weeping. He wanted me to give you a message. He said they are putting the mountain house on the market today. They're liquidating everything Clara bought to pay back the remaining interest on that home equity line of credit, to ensure there is no trace of the debt left in any bank database. Julian had to tell her, Eleanor. He had to confess to the forgery to make her sign the withdrawal. The marriage? Julian's secretary said Clara's family is already consulting a divorce attorney. The most devastating truth is not the one delivered by an enemy, but the one you are forced to tell the person who believed you were a god. Clara's world of effortless prestige, of country club luncheons and mountain chalets, had collapsed in a single morning. The husband she had used as a social ladder was now a confessed criminal, one step away from a federal prison, and her name was tied to his ruin. "They did it to themselves, Marcus," I said quietly. "Yes," Marcus agreed, a long sigh escaping his throat. "They did. The escrow on the orchard house cleared 10 minutes ago, Eleanor. The $2.25 million is officially in your trust. You are free." "I have been free since Wednesday morning, Marcus," I said. "But it is nice to have the paperwork confirm it." The rest of Monday and Tuesday passed in a state of quiet, healing solitude. On Wednesday morning, a courier arrived at my cottage. He was wearing the uniform of a local delivery service, and he carried a small, square, cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked, holding out a digital clipboard for my signature. "Yes," I said, signing my name with a steady, practiced hand. I carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. The return address was the Orchard House. But it wasn't from Julian, and it wasn't from Beatrice. It was from the new owners, the Chicago family who had bought the property. On the top of the box, taped to the brown paper, was a neat, handwritten note from the wife, a woman named Sarah Jackson. "Dear Eleanor," the note read, "we are so incredibly in love with the house. Thank you for leaving it in such beautiful, immaculate condition. Yesterday, our contractor was inspecting the chimney in the master bedroom, the one with the local river stones Arthur laid. He found a loose stone near the mantelpiece. Behind it, tucked into a small cavity in the brick, was this wooden box. It has your name carved on the lid. We wanted to make sure it was returned to you immediately, as it clearly belongs to your history, not ours. Warmest regards, Sarah." I stared at the note, my heart giving a single, hard thud against my ribs. A loose stone near the mantelpiece. Arthur had built that chimney himself in the winter of 1978. I remembered him coming home with his hands raw and bleeding from the cold river stones, his face covered in gray mortar dust, but his eyes bright with pride. I tore the brown paper off the box. Inside was a small cedar box, about the size of a book. The wood was dark, aged, and smelled faintly of cedar oil and dried lavender. On the lid, carved in Arthur's distinctive, neat block print, was my name, Eleanor. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the small brass latch and pulled the lid open. Inside the box, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a small, rusted iron key, a gold wedding band, and a thick, handwritten journal I had never seen before. The cedar wood was cool against my palms, smelling deeply of resin and decades of dry dark. I lifted the rusted iron key from the faded velvet, its rough, pitted surface scraping slightly against my fingertips. I knew this key. It was the key to the small, green-painted pine sea chest Arthur had built for me in the winter of 1971, just 3 months before we married. It had sat in the corner of our bedroom for 40 years, a quiet, heavy piece of furniture with iron straps and brass rivets. When we had moved our belongings from our first small apartment to the Orchard House in 1978, the key had vanished. I had spent weeks searching for it, eventually resigning myself to the idea that it had slipped through a crack in the floorboards of the old truck. Arthur had offered to force the lock, but I had refused. It felt wrong to break his craftsmanship. So the green chest had remained locked, a beautiful, silent block of pine in the corner of our room, its contents a forgotten mystery to everyone but the man who had built it. Now I knew why the key had vanished. Arthur had taken it. He had hidden it behind the loose river stone in the chimney, waiting for the day when I would find it, not as a grieving widow inside the walls of our crowded family home, but as a woman who had finally reclaimed her own life. I picked up the thick, leather-bound journal. The leather was soft, scuffed at the corners, and bound with a simple strip of brown twine. I untied the knot, opened the first page, and felt a quiet, sharp ache in my chest as Arthur's strong, slanted handwriting filled my eyes. The journal was not a record of his work or of the garden or of the weather. It was a letter to me, written in small fragments over the span of 30 years. The first entry was dated October 14th, 1982. Julian was 6. Beatrice was 4. "My dearest Eleanor," Arthur wrote, "today I watched you in the garden. You were trying to paint the old pear tree, the one that had just begun to bear fruit. You had your small easel set up under the shade of the birch, and for an hour your face had that beautiful, quiet light it used to have when we were young, before the babies came. But then Julian fell from the porch and scraped his knee, and Beatrice began to cry because she was hungry, and you dropped your brush into the dirt to run to them. You didn't go back to the easel, Eleanor. You cleaned Julian's knee, you made Beatrice her lunch, and then you packed up your paints and put them in the green sea chest in our room. I saw you lock it. I saw the way you looked at the key, as if you were locking away a part of yourself that you could no longer afford to keep. I realized then that motherhood is a slow, beautiful execution. You are giving them your life, drop by drop, and they are drinking it without ever realizing they are thirsty. I took the key from your dresser tonight, my love. I cannot stop you from sacrificing yourself for our children. You are a mother, and your heart is too large for its own safety. But I will not let you destroy the girl I married. I have locked your sketchbooks, your early poetry, and your grandmother's gold ring inside the green chest. I am hiding the key. I will keep it safe until the day when your labor is finally finished, when the children have gone, and you need to remember who you were before you became their mother. I sat in the quiet of my new living room, the book resting in my lap, tears blurring the ink until the letters ran together like rain on a window pane. A good husband does not just love the woman you became. He protects the girl you had to leave behind. Arthur had seen it all. He had seen the invisible subtraction of my life, the way I had slowly buried my own dreams, my own voice, and my own identity beneath the endless laundry, the burnt dinners, the parent-teacher conferences, and the quiet, crushing weight of my children's expectations. I stood up, my knees no longer aching, my chest feeling as light and open as the sky above the bay. I walked into my bedroom. The green-painted pine sea chest was sitting in the corner, its iron straps dull but solid under the morning sun. I had insisted the movers bring it to the cottage, despite Julian's complaints that old painted box is just firewood, Mom. We should throw it in the dumpster. I knelt in front of the chest, the small pine grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking with a steady, gentle rhythm. I took the rusted iron key from my pocket. I inserted it into the heavy iron lock. The metal was stiff, resisting for a fraction of a second before the gears inside caught with a deep, solid click. I turned the key. The latch released. I lifted the heavy pine lid. The scent of dried lavender and ancient cedar instantly filled the room, sweet, sharp, and smelling of 1971. Resting on top of a stack of old yellowed sketchbooks was a small, delicate gold ring. My grandmother's wedding band, the one I thought I had lost in the harbor 40 years ago. Underneath it were 3 leather-bound volumes of poetry I had written in college, before I had met Arthur, back when I believed the world was a canvas waiting for my brush. I picked up the first sketchbook. I opened the pages. There were drawings of the harbor, of the old ferry we had ridden on our first date, of Arthur's young, laughing face, and of my own hands, young, unspotted, and holding a paintbrush. I sat on the wooden floorboards of my new bedroom, surrounded by the fragments of my own youth. I felt no regret. I felt no anger. The years I had given to Julian and Beatrice were not wasted. They were simply a long, difficult winter I had survived. But the spring had finally arrived. I slipped my grandmother's gold ring onto my finger next to my own wedding band. It fit perfectly, cold and solid against my skin. I picked up a charcoal pencil from the bottom of the chest, opened a blank page in the sketchbook, and looked out the window at the lighthouse. The light was sweeping across the water, bright, steady, and entirely mine. The first frost of autumn arrived in mid-September, coating the wild rosemary outside my cottage door in a delicate silver lace that vanished the moment the morning sun cleared the horizon. I sat at my small kitchen table, a fresh sheet of heavy watercolor paper resting in front of me. On it, I had begun a simple sketch of the lighthouse, the lines of charcoal soft and gray against the cream page. Beside my easel sat a bowl of plums, harvested from the local market downtown. They were small, dark purple, and tasted of the cold earth and early rain. My phone, resting on the corner of the sideboard, remained entirely silent. I had not turned on the old phone in 3 weeks. It sat in the bottom drawer of Arthur's roll-top desk, its battery dead, its screen dark, a cold monument to a life I had left behind. Once that silence would have filled me with a heavy, suffocating anxiety. I would have worried about Julian's blood pressure, about Beatrice's rent, about whether Clara's luncheons had gone smoothly, or if the grandchildren had remembered their coats. I had spent 40 years believing that if I stopped worrying, if I stopped holding the sky up with my own bent back, the world would collapse. But the world does not collapse when a mother stops carrying it. It simply readjusts. From Marcus, I received occasional quiet updates during our Tuesday afternoon walks along the harbor. The mountain house had been sold. It had went quickly, purchased by a developer for slightly less than Julian had paid, but the proceeds had been entirely used to clear the forged line of credit and settle the legal fees Clara's brief, disastrous lawsuit had incurred. Julian remained at his firm, but he was no longer a rising star. He sat in his corner office, quiet, careful, and entirely neutered, knowing that every document he signed, every transaction he managed, was under the silent, permanent shadow of the safety deposit box downtown. He was a warden of his own cage, and I held the key. Clara had filed for legal separation. The luxury apartment in the city was on the market, and she was currently living with her sister in Aspen, her dreams of social dominance shattered by the revelation of her husband's crimes. Beatrice had taken a position as a retail manager at a boutique she had once tried to buy, finally learning the hard, quiet reality of an hourly wage. They did not call me. They did not try to find me. To them, I was no longer a mother or a grandmother or a resource. I was a quiet, dangerous stranger who had dismantled their lives with a few strokes of a fountain pen and a folder of old paper. They had mistook my silence for weakness, and by the time they realized that my silence was actually the foundation of their entire world, the foundation had already been removed. I looked out the window of my cottage. The bay was dark blue today, the cold wind from the north kicking up whitecaps that shattered against the gray stones of the breakwater. In the distance, the yellow light of the lighthouse began its slow, rhythmic sweep, a silent, steady beacon that did not ask the sea for permission to shine. I picked up my brush. I dipped it into the clean water, then into the dark indigo paint on my palette. I did not paint the orchard house. I did not paint the empty rooms, or the unwashed dishes, or the cracked teacups of my past. I painted the water. I painted the sky. I painted the solitary gull riding the wind above the cliffs, completely free of the shore. I am 72 years old. My name is Eleanor. I am no longer the structure holding everyone else together. I am simply a woman sitting by a window, watching the tide come in, holding a brush in hands that are finally entirely my own. The paperwork arrived in Tuesday's mail, delivered by Marcus's quiet assistant in a plain manila envelope. I did not open it immediately. I made myself a cup of black tea, sat by the window of my new cottage, and watched the fog slowly lift from the bay. Only when the harbor was clear did I slide the documents onto the table. It was a property deed. It did not bear my name, but rather the name of the Arthur Vance Foundation, a private charitable trust I had quietly established on the day the Orchard House escrow cleared. The deed was for the timber lodge on the ridge, the luxury mountain home Julian and Clara had spent 5 years boasting about to their country club friends. It was the house Julian had forged his father's signature to purchase, the trophy that had cost him his integrity, his peace, and eventually his marriage. When Julian was forced to liquidate the property within 72 hours to pay off the remaining balance of the forged bank loan, he had listed it in a panic, desperate for any cash offer that would close immediately and stop the title audit. He had slashed the price by 40%. He had expected a predatory investor or a corporate buyer to snatch it up. He did not know that the corporate buyer, operating under a quiet Delaware registry, was funded entirely by the cash from the sale of my home. My trust had purchased his mountain lodge for a fraction of its value, using his own greed to fund the transaction. I had no intention of ever standing on that mountain balcony. The house smelled of Clara's heavy perfumes and Julian's cold calculations. I had no use for 5 bedrooms of timber and glass. Instead, the transfer papers I signed on Tuesday afternoon converted the luxury lodge into a permanent, fully funded sanctuary for elderly women, specifically widows who had been left with nothing by children who had stripped their estates bare. By October, the silver-framed photographs of Julian's family would be gone from the stone mantelpiece. In their place would be a quiet, warm library, a garden tended by hands that had spent too long cleaning up after others, and a brass plaque near the front entrance bearing a simple dedication: the Arthur Vance House of Grace. On Wednesday evening, my phone vibrated once. It was a text from Marcus. Julian found out today, the message read. His firm was retained to handle the zoning transfer for the charity. He had to sign the final title release as the seller, recognizing the buyer's trust. My assistant said he sat at his desk for an hour after signing, staring at his father's name on the deed, unable to speak. I did not reply. I set the phone down and walked out to the small stone patio. The wind off the water was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the incoming autumn. The lighthouse on the point was already beginning its work, its long yellow beam cutting through the gathering dark, sweeping over the black rocks and the endless rolling waves. They had spent years treating my home like a free hotel, confident that the old woman in the kitchen would always be there to keep the sheets clean and the fire lit. Now they were paying the rent, and I was finally resting.